Lovely. So, welcome again to Jeremy. I'll let him take it from here, and we look forward to chatting with everybody in 15 to 20 minutes.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Caroline, and thanks so much for everyone for joining us this afternoon, particularly over your lunch. I hope we're not stopping you from tucking in. And just a big thank you for the AQR for hosting this week and making this week happen, and really for inviting us to just share some ideas with you, really, which is the point of today. I've got a couple of ideas to share. Love to hear your thoughts and your questions about those. So with no further ado, the big idea for me, and what Caroline and I have been talking about, is there's more to social than listening. That's the whole point. If you can take anything away from what we're going to talk to today, is just this idea of there being more to social media, more to how we can interpret social media, more than we can get out of that data than what we're currently getting from social listening. That's not that I have a problem with social listening. I just don't think it's terribly insightful. I think there's a lot more that we can get from it. The context for this idea is that social media, whether you use it actively or passively or not at all, is really having a profound effect on people, culture, and consumer behavior. And that's completely undeniable. There are loads of really strong case studies. We know this to be a truth. But I believe it's also time that the ability, the role that social media plays in shaping people's these things like culture and consumer behavior needs to be properly reflected in market research and consumer research. So in terms about, okay, what's new here? Why is this idea new? So since the kind of like the early days of web scraping, which is about 10, 15 years ago, then we sort of evolved into social media monitoring, and now it's called social listening. All through that kind of evolutionary process, that development process, the market and the use cases have really been driven by the technology and what the technology is able to do. It does some amazing things, right? It collects this amazing data from in near real time from all over the place. I'm not being Debbie Downer on the technology, because it is wonderful. But let's look at what we get out from social listening, because it is essentially fieldwork. It's data and some tabs. And that's great, but it's analytics. It's not insight. There is so much more to it than we can get. So Caroline's wrong. I'm not going to send you a bunch of charts today, because that's not really my thing. We're much more of a pictures kind of company. So when we think about the capabilities of social listening as a discipline, of course, it's improved over time, and there's some really interesting ways that they're bringing AI into thematic analysis of the data. But at the moment, right now, and to where we've got to, it's essentially an analytics platform. It's not an insight platform. And it's become synonymous with, sorry, it's hard for me to say, its use has become synonymous with three main use cases. This is about understanding risk, it's about understanding reputation, and it's about tracking your campaign performance. And as you'll spot all of those immediately, they all tend to be very much focused on brand. They might sit in CSR, they might sit in corporate reputation, they might sit in marketing. None of those things really sort of lend themselves too much to sitting in naturally from an analytical point of view for the kind of work that we do. It's all about the brand and not necessarily about people, individuals, groups, or culture. So it brings me on to the point, like, what are we missing with all of this? This focus on the technology means that we tend to forget the people. We're kind of listening to how we as brands are being perceived in the world. And we're forgetting the point that social media at its heart is really the stories of people's lives. It is a reflection of what people choose to do, how they interact, what they're interested in, who they want to talk to, what they find stimulating, what they want to put out into the world. And if we were to think about the volume of content between sort of the brand content on one side and all of the rest of the individual people content on the other, it's going to be massively skewed towards the people side of it. Social media is around people. Brands have a role to play. Of course they do, but they're not the star of the show for most people in this context. So what we see in social media is what people are doing, what their hopes are, what their fears are, what concerns are, what's making them laugh, what's making them cry. It's an everyday conversation that's grounded in the everyday reality of people's lives. And as such, it's just an incredibly rich source of observational insight. Data from social media, I think, is really special, and it's fundamentally different from traditional market research. So if we're thinking about, usually what we're trying to do is do the same thing better. But I think that social media has an ability to enable us to do something different. And for our perspective, having done this for a while, social data reveals three kind of hidden parts of life. It shows us people's hidden lives. it talks to us and reveals their hidden moments, and really importantly, it talks about hidden influence. And for me, these characteristics are vital as they're bringing something genuinely new to market research, which is why we can't just leave social to listening, because it misses it. Just tapping into each of these kind of areas in a little bit more detail or a little bit more depth. There's a slightly uncomfortable truth that I always feel slightly nervous about talking to researchers about, but I'm going to go for it. This is the truth that sort of lies at the heart of what makes social data and most social media data so unique. And it's the idea that people don't talk to researchers in the way they talk to each other. And we know this, right? Because we've been researchers. I've been doing traditional research a long time before I started doing this. We know about the biases that come in. And so if we accept that idea to be true, that people don't talk to researchers the way they talk to each other, then we know that there's an inherent bias, and we know there's inherent flaws in any kind of research design. And really the only way to get around those biases is to observe data. And the best way to observe people without interfering with it is through social media, because it really is the only place where we can observe people's behavior without influencing it. And that gives us access to really raw, natural, unbiased discussion about an enormous range of aspects of life. There are no topic guides, there's no stim, there's no sandwiches from Pret. You get what people choose to talk about in their words, in the social places they choose to be. And as such, that's a really profoundly different perspective on people and their lives. Of course, it's not going to unveil things that are going to be unexpected. It's going to get those things that you seeing people's everyday lives. You're just seeing it in a slightly different lens. And I think the analogy or the comparison I would bring here is when we're designing our topic guides, when we're designing our surveys, they're all so driven by what our clients need to know, which makes a ton of sense. But that isn't how people live their lives. People don't live their lives thinking around how to discuss X brand in terms of the attributes that that brand is associated, decides to be associated with. They don't care. So we need to step outside of that bias, and social media is a really lovely way of introducing us to a different relationship we can have with consumers and the lives that they're having. The second idea that I wanted to share was that of hidden moments. And this is another thing that will make me massively popular amongst this audience. So this is about this idea that social media data captures action, opinion, and emotion as it happens. If I think about my Jurassic Park hat on here, it's really the mosquito trapped in the amber. And I say this a bit tongue in cheek, but traditional market research is based on imagination on one side and memory on the other. And what I mean by that is we're asking people to remember what they did or felt, or we're asking them to imagine what they might do or how they might feel. And social data is a counterbalance to that because it reveals these otherwise hidden moments. And it's lovely. You can track them over time. You've got it locked in. Importantly, social can give us access to those parts of life above that where people might actually not feel comfortable sharing with researchers. So you've got these hidden moments where social is really bringing us a different perspective on life. And lastly, and really importantly, I can talk about influencers all day, but for me, influence on social is incredibly important. And I don't just mean influence with a big I like the Kardashians and the beauty influencers. I think it's much more profound than that and much deeper than that. So for me, this kind of like unique quality about social data is the idea of hidden influence. So when we think about the posts, the comments, what people are sharing, the videos that they're putting up there, all of this data that people are sharing in myriad forms, it has the ability to influence opinion, feelings, and actions of people, irrespective of whether we know about it or not. It's in a social space. If we think about contrasting it to traditional research, traditional research doesn't have any external influencing power. It doesn't exist outside of the client or you. It doesn't inhabit a social space. It's not being seen. It's not being interacted with. Social data, on the other hand, exists in this perpetual social space, either waiting to be found, shared, or served up through algorithmic serendipity. If we think about it in those terms, it's almost negligent for us not to be aware of what's happening. I've got a couple of examples that I'll talk through to sort of show that to life a little bit. And I'm sorry, the sound's not working on this next slide for some reason that's related to Zoom, but hopefully you can see the captions. So I'll just let that play. No, I love Andy and I love that clip. I think it's really interesting because it summarizes so much of the real opportunity and the challenge of social media. So we have an example of a successful business that's interacting with social through channels that it's really comfortable with and knows and is working with celebrities. It's doing a lot of the marketing mix well. But outside of that, unknown to it, completely unrelated to it, completely outside of anything they were trying to do, a massive demand generator just comes along almost by luck, by chance, and actually massively stimulates demand for what they're happening. Our argument is that these things are out there. There are people who are spending their time on social media looking for inspiration about private dining. There are people talking about great places to go to experience private dining. This ecosystem is there. Just because Andy doesn't know about it doesn't mean it's not there and it's not important. And this is a really pivotal point from today's session, that social media captures interest, it captures latent demand for a topic, and we'll talk about that in a second. And that demand is available for us as organizations to tap into, to get. And what brings that latent demand together are these influencers, are these content creators. Now, they're saying that content creates community. Great content brings people together around it because we want to watch. And social is becoming more and more entertainment focused as the days go on, particularly with the likes of YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, really driving the visual and the video elements of social. So you get this ability where content is creating community, and that community almost acts like a channel. It does act like a channel. It's capturing demand, it's capturing intent, it's capturing individual interest, which then for organizations is a really important opportunity for them to understand their audience, understand how to play within that market space, and then to seek new segments. So there's one use case here which I think is really, really important, which is understanding how people come together on social and seeing that as an alternative segmentation to drive marketing and go-to-market strategies. The next example that I wanted to talk about, I don't know if you're familiar with a skincare brand called CeraVe, but they had a really remarkable shift. They've been around for about, I think it was 2014. They're around. They were bought by L'Oreal, so they've grown steadily, and they really based on getting some fundamentals right. And for CeraVe, it's very much around the value proposition created by dermatologists, very much focused on some of the real fundamental needs of skincare. And if we contrast that with what we see in most advertising, it's very much around glossy adverts, young girls with flawless skin, splashing water on their face and going, thank you, Neutrogena, everything's brilliant now. And we get that idealized image, but it's not the reality for a lot of people. And CeraVe spoke to reality. And what they did is they created a really great campaign. They worked with some influencers, but the influencers they worked with had built communities around skincare. So Dr. Dre's one, not that one, a different one. Hiram Skincare was another one. There are 3 or 4 skincare influencers they worked with. These guys had built really big communities of interest around their content. And they talk about blemishes, they talk about redness, they talk about blotchiness, they talk about the realities of trying to improve their skin wellness and their wellness and the appearance of their skin. They talk about it in real terms. They're not beholden to brands. They're not pumping out brand messages. It's real life, right? They're talking about the things that matter to people. And that communication, that content, because it was done in the right way, was able to build a really big community. And then CeraVe was able to then tap into that. So what happened is in the last few years, CeraVe managed to grow its market share by hundreds of millions of dollars. They did it in about a year, which is phenomenal. What they did is they understood the needs of an overlooked and misunderstood group of consumers. They were able to activate new demand spaces and disrupt the existing, and with market disrupting returns. CeraVe's primary activation channel during this time was TikTok, which they used to then drive traffic to longer form YouTube videos. And they worked with specialist skincare influencers. And what I've just got is this chart. So this chart is Google search trend data over the period of time. So it starts in 2004. You see CeraVe's doing nothing. I've contrasted it with Neutrogena. New genius having fun, Sarah V's doing nothing, still doing nothing. Where are you, Sarah V? All new genius have a spike, and then, oh dear. So what we've got is a market incumbent that's in a dominant search position all the way through that situation. And then we've got in a space of a very, very limited, we're talking months about this spike. And this wasn't text social, it wasn't happening on Twitter, it wasn't really happening on forums. This is mostly TikTok and YouTube video. But it's such an enormous shift. And that's the potential, right? This is what we get when we think about social being more than listening. We think about going, I'm using social media to understand groups of people with discrete needs so that we can actually activate that demand by creating better products for them, engaging with them in the way that they want to be engaged with, and getting our go-to-market strategies to be much, much more effective. So that's kind of like why I think social is important. There's a couple of use cases about how I've seen activating social in the right way, driving insight or using insight to drive effective go-to-market strategies is important. I'm just going to flip it a little bit or shift focus a little bit more to think about, okay, well is it, where does it fit? Is it best for everything? And if you look at the social listening vendors' websites, you'd imagine that social listening can conquer any insight requirement, which is of course nonsense. In my mind, there is no perfect answer, right? So different sources give us different answers. Different methods help us find those different answers. I've been doing social listening, enhanced social listening, for 13 years. And from that experience, I think the most powerful uses for it is around exploration and divergent thinking. This is where social's access to those hidden lives, hidden moments, and hidden influence bring its unique value to fore. They help us explore human experience in whatever category we're looking at, as well as understanding how people intersect with different social spaces and the influences and how that influences what they think, feel, and do. It's a really great tool for thinking, where do we start? Where do we go? How can we challenge what we know? So typically for us, we'd design a load of hypotheses up front and then take that into the data. I'll talk a little bit about our method in a second and how that fits into it. But it's that very much, right, the world's out there. How can we understand the space? We did a really great piece recently about the future of potato. We've done another really interesting piece around culinary, about actually how the world of food might change. So when you start that, you need a really grounded starting point to think about where you're going to go before you start getting skewed between what the client might think they want to know. When we think about the use cases for social, I think they tend to fall into three main areas that I think create the most value. The first one is about brand growth, and here's the overlap with social listening a little bit more. For me, brand growth is around how do we find opportunities in the way that brands are perceived and engaged with by people. So I'm talking about customer experiences, I'm talking about journey mapping, these are your review data. I'm thinking about the effectiveness of the campaigns that you've had, thinking about how people naturally perceive your brand. We did a lovely piece with the British Red Cross that we worked with for years, really around their brand perception and how it's changing through the years. And one of the attributes that we found in the natural conversation was about actually whether they were needed. And I've never designed any survey where one of the brand attributes was, do people think we should exist? Because no corporate's going to ask that. But if you look at the nature of the data, it's there. And this particularly comes into British Red Cross's work in humanitarian aid overseas, where there's a subsection of the population that don't think that's important and don't think British Cross should be doing that, so not needed in that example. The next one is around customer acquisition. So this is the example that we talked about with Haugens and CeraVe, where it's around finding new audiences, where they are, how big they are, how to access them, mapping traditional segmentations onto social spaces and behavior, thinking about how to inspire your creative teams with content that's coming from social, and understanding that the role of influence across your market and how it's shaping awareness, consideration, and intent. And then the last area that we tend to work in, or I think social has a really strong use case, is around market innovation. So this is about surfacing the jobs to be done. So what are these fundamental needs that your audience, your customers, the groups of people that you're interested in have? What are they trying to do? What are the needs that underpin those jobs to be done? What are the motivations? What's in the way? What are the frustrations? What are the barriers? And this is about developing really powerful go-to-market strategies by understanding the existing category expectations and norms. So we'd like to think when we're doing market entry that there's no one there before us, but that's never the case. There's always something there. There's always alternatives. And all of those alternatives will be playing out on social. So if we're thinking about market entry, it's a really great way of, or an additional way of thinking, how do I understand the dynamics and the norms of that category? And then the final element of that would be actually what big trends are influencing what's going on. So I think it's wars, it's inflation, it's macroeconomics, it's sustainability. How are these influencing mass behavior? And interestingly, how are they influencing early adopter behavior and the combination and the crossover between the two? So just that this isn't a deep session on the method, but just to give you a sense of how we go about it. So we have a dedicated team that work to create in-house insight from social data, and there's a combination here of our flow. It starts with, we don't hate the question, let's do a little bit of social listening, right? It's a proper project. It should be done, set up properly, and all of this is we start with the end in mind. So instead of just seeing what's out there, we really focus on where are we going to create value. What's the question that needs addressing? What's the insight need? What are the hypotheses? So in the way, it sounds exactly like a proper market research project, because that's what it should be. The next stage is really around insight generation. And here it's a combination of qualitative research techniques. So we use grounded theory as a sort of like a baseline for guiding all of our methodologies and how they fit together. So that's working from the data and then working from the data to provide, to determine the codes, the categories, the hypotheses, theories. It's narrative analysis, it's discourse analysis, it's thematic analysis, it's synthesis, it's narrative development. These are the insight tools that we're using. Alongside that, and increasingly, we're blending it with AI technologies, which are enabling us to extend the reach of our data collection, extend the reach of our synthesis, extend the reach of our thinking process around how we're interpreting the data. And for us, it's very much a bit like a barcode. So a bit of white, which is us, a bit of black, which is AI, a bit of white. So it's just, it feeds in and goes all the way across. From our experience so far, and we test this quite a lot, it's not good enough to be let alone and let loose on the data, because the number of false positives that are going to come back. I'm really happy to talk about that. It needs careful hand. I think co-intelligence is probably the best term that I've found to explain how it should fit in. So that's that insight generation process. And then finally, it's around how do we activate that? And here it's around how do we bring it to life? So it's debriefs, it's playbacks, it's ideations, it's workshops. Again, it's the disciplines and it's the practices and it's the established tools and techniques of market research. What we do is market research. We just use social data as our fundamental input into that process. So just finally here, just like where does social fit? Where can we be part of the team, right? So social, I think, plays really nicely with other methods. Some of my favorite projects and some of my favorite clients that we've been working with for years are strategy agencies, they're ad agencies, they're brand strategy people. And what we give them and what social data gives them is breadth. They can do the depth, right? So they can do their 10, 20 in-depth IDIs with individuals, and they're going to get really, really deep. And what they're going to be able to do is go deep on a particular element. They're going to be able to deliberate, and they're going to be able to pose, and they're going to be able to probe. You know what it is. What we can give them is the top of the T. We give them breadth. So when they go back to the client, they can start with us, and we can we can define the shape of that conversation, what it looks like, what are the dominant themes, and then they can then pick up those dominant themes and go, right, we're going to deep dive on those. So that works really nicely in that. From a quant angle, it can also work really nicely in helping frame what questions should be asked. By looking really broadly, but without steering the data set, you can start to see actually what people choose to talk about rather than what we imagine they might be talking about, or just relying on what the brand wants to know. So it makes the questions we ask more meaningful. It brings life to quant, and it brings breadth to qual. So we work, as I said, we work with research, advertising people, brand strategy agencies to really help them understand this breadth of human experience and how that then plays out in the social space. This then helps shape deeper, more targeted and deliberative research phases for them. Cool. Thanks so much for bearing with me. That's all of my kind of like chatty bit. Chuck it open to questions.